Thank you, everyone, for coming. I appreciate a great turnout. Welcome. Thank you, press, and everyone, for your interest in this matter. We all know it's a vital, important matter to Central New York. I'd like to introduce our speakers today, and I'll do some brief introductions, and then we'll turn it over to our first speaker. But with us today, immediately on my left, is Pat Rector. Pat is the Outlook educator for the Occupational Health Clinical Center at SUNY Upstate Medical University. My far left is Rosemary Klein. Rosemary is the Director of Clinical Services for the Occupational Health Clinical Center at SUNY Upstate Medical University. Thank you, Pat and Rosemary. And of course, in the middle, I think we all know, is Alec Baldwin. Alec has a long record of charitable work and involvement in environmental matters. So thank you, everyone, for joining. I'd like to turn it over to Pat for her remarks. We'll go through speakers' remarks first, and then we'll open up to Q&A. Thank you. Pat.
Thank you. I am here on behalf of the Occupational Health Clinical Center, its medical director, Dr. Michael Lax, and its advisory board. I am joined by my colleague, Rosemary Klein, who's nurse practitioner and director of clinical services. We are here to publicly urge a reconsideration of the plan to embed toxic waste permanently in the storage area known as Waste Bed 13, especially now that so many families live, work, and play in the nearby area. We are skeptical of the methodology of human health risk assessment that has been employed by Honeywell and the DEC. While our concerns for risks to human health are real, our reasoning is unsentimental. The assumptions contained in the risk assessment, we believe, are deeply problematic. The mathematical presentation of the risk assessment methodology, while it may appear precise, hides much uncertainty about toxins that are adverse to human health. Uncertainties abound. Exposure level variability to toxins by multiple exposure routes has not been carefully considered. Ignorance of the precise composition of the materials entering the waste bed and the cumulative impact of chemical mixtures, another variable that has not been sufficiently considered. Ignorance of how and at what levels individual toxins pose risk to pregnant women, to fetuses, to children, and to adults with medical conditions that might make them more vulnerable to risk. There's ignorance of how such materials will likely move through air or water or the food chain. There are limitations of the technology used to store the toxins, with no guarantee that over time the materials might not leak into the environment or into the water table. Any one of these assumptions, these methodological assumptions, which are, if flawed, could lead to risks unimagined. As an occupational health clinical center, we also have very specific concerns regarding exposure of workers, their proper protection, and the provisions for their health monitoring if this plan goes forward as it is considered. Workers' well-being is often the last to be considered, if considered at all. A fundamental tenet of occupational medicine is the precautionary principle. When possible, risks of exposure are, and when possible risks of exposure are great and many uncertainties exist, it is better to err on the side of caution rather than await health effects that later prove adverse. Consistent with that precautionary principle, we urge disposal of toxic waste at a dedicated hazardous waste site disposal that minimizes the risks to human health. appropriate environmental and human health monitoring and exposure controls for workers involved in the transport and disposal of wastes, and the involvement of the EPA to stop the dumping of lake materials into wastebed 13, and the involvement of OSHA to determine the necessary worker health protections. Every day in our practice, we see both the resilience and the vulnerability of human life. In the light of new developments, quite literally, our thinking needs to be adjusted with human lives in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. I'd like to just set some quick context before turning it over to our next speaker. We're talking about a plan that currently calls for dredging some 7% of the hazardous substances in the lake. So it's 7% of the damage that's already been done to the environment. And this environment, of course, is well known to everybody as probably the third most polluted hazardous disaster, environmental disaster, forgive me, in the world. And they're talking about dredging 7% of it. That 7% translates to some 2 million cubic yards of hazardous substances. Those hazardous substances would equate to something on the order of 19.1 million Toyota Camrys. So if that gives you a sense for size and scope. To put it in a more local sense, you're looking at enough content to fill something on the order of 10 carrier domes. 10 carrier domes of toxic hazardous substances that would be pumped from the bottom of the lake and dumped into the town of Camillus. That's the current proposal. So of course, with that, we have a number of concerns, as Pat outlined. And those concerns we really feel have not been adequately addressed. When it comes to situations or requests for HHRA, that HHRA should not just be for the current plan, but also for the existing waste beds that they plan to dump in. That apparently has not been addressed so far, and we've made that request. This type of testing should involve things like test wells, toxicology reports, in addition to the various failure modes that the SCA plan is susceptible to. So I just wanted to give you that brief context, a brief insight into the scope and the magnitude of what we're talking about and the type of testing that we're asking for. Thank you.